When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky.
Hey, so sound good?
Yeah, welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Ronna, and today I'm joined by Cassandra Martineau, who is our Green Party candidate this year for Lieutenant Governor. And we'll talk about all kinds of things, Green Party, Cassandra, and what does a Lieutenant Governor do anyway? So welcome. This show is not being aired live, so you can't call in, but it will be airing tonight on all the Southeastern Connecticut TV channels. So welcome, Cass.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming down to New London. I wanted to start out, I guess, by asking you just a little bit about yourself and why you agreed to take on this task of going out there and running for a big statewide office.
I wasn't sure about it at first, to be honest. But, partly the job of a lieutenant governor is to support the governor and the gubernatorial candidate. And as soon as I found Michelle Louise Bicking was running, I'm here like, oh, I'm in. I will be on a ticket with her any day of the week. I ran for Congress in 2nd District a couple of years ago for the party. And I think my brain and is more oriented towards, I'm very involved in local politics as well, so I'm kind of pretty well steeped in that and some of the national issues. But this encouraged me to take my focus onto some of the state issues and some of the things that we have going on in this state. We are one of the richest states and the richest nation in the world. Mostly, in my opinion, the national status is because of colonialism and oppression of other peoples and stealing their wealth. But we also, regardless, we do have a lot of wealth here in Connecticut, and we also have incredible amounts of poverty. Anybody who's done teaching and moved around from district to district gets a real life education in that, face to face, just the amount of resources one district has and another district does not, and the stark differences. And it's not entirely racial. I worked up in Stafford Springs, and there were loads and loads of poor white students there who were still deprived of issues. But in many cases it is. And if you have some melanin in your skin, you're much more likely to be living in one of these districts that's not so well funded. These inequities eat away at me, partly just because it just seems morally atrocious to me, partly as a trans woman. I've been at the kicking end of it as well, and I suffered a lot of that marginalization because of that. So, when I see these systems that work inherently and unfairly, I feel impelled to speak up. It's all we can do.
Well, to me, it kills me that this is one of the 2 or 3 wealthiest states in the wealthiest country in the world, and yet I believe that Hartford is often on lists of the poorest cities in the country, and Bridgeport and some of the rural poor areas also are really terrible examples of inequality. And you're working in the education system, you probably got a front row seat because the way our property taxation works and the way our schools are funded guarantees that the inequalities
Cycles
from
of
town to
poverty.
town are going to replicate themselves throughout the educational opportunities.
So while I was working over at Eastern on my master's degree in early childhood education, we were challenged to do a paper on No Child Left Behind, which at that point was still kind of new. And for the fun of it, and because who doesn't want to do twice the work they need to in a master's degree, I did what I called a tale of two cities. And I did a comparison of Mansfield, which is right next to the town that I was going to school in and live in, Willimantic. And you can't get the income levels, but you can see things like the amount of free lunches students give out, which is an indication of things. Right. And you see the resources between Willimantic and Mansfield, the next door neighbors, right next door, and which zip code you get born into has a great determinant on your future. Mansfield's got, and I worked there and appreciated many people I worked with, but they've got a lot more resources. They've got lower staff to student ratios. They've got better services for, children with special needs, et cetera, et cetera.
And probably fewer children with special needs who actually need those supports proportionally.
As always goes along with poverty, it seems. It's been proven that poverty in children who grow up in poverty, it actually literally affects their brains. And we're failing so much of the population by allowing this to happen. Personally, I've got pretty socialist leanings, and this to me seems a natural outcome of capitalism. The whole point of capitalism is that it picks winners and losers. And as we have done in the US, and many times that's along racial lines and gender lines and many of the other groups that we're taught to hate are the groups that we're oppressing the most generally. And of course, Willimantic does have a high Latino population. Mansfield did well with the standardized testing. They've got more resources they can put to it, therefore they get more funding. Willimantic did not do very well with the testing.
You got a special master,
We got
right?
a special master who does things like cut out arts and get rid of bilingual education in a town that's 50% Latin. And, no excuses, and poverty isn't an excuse. So, you're factoring out things that we absolutely know do contribute and do make a difference in students' success and citizens' success. Being caught in poverty is expensive. And the children who are brought up in that are much more likely to repeat those cycles, When I was in Willimantic and saw this lovely young white teacher yelling at a poor black kid because he wasn't paying attention, and then found out that child was literally homeless, sleeping in his car the night before, and it's like, are you kidding me? Of course he's not paying attention. What kind of sleep did he get the night before? How's he eating? Do we even know these things? And when our focus, as it is with No Child Left Behind, is just upon performance and not the quality of life for the children that we're serving, I feel like we're doing something very, very wrong. And I see that throughout much of Connecticut. We've got a lot of wonderful, great things for some.
Yeah, certainly not for all. I worked for Head Start when the No Child Left Behind came through. And, some of the things that came through were intentionally discriminatory and some not so intentionally discriminatory. But for a couple years, there was a pre- and post-testing program for 4-year-olds in Head Start. And it ultimately was ended because they were not allowed to use it by the Head Start enabling legislation to judge Head Start programs, and the information about how the students did was not disseminated in a way that you could use that information to plan for a kid's education. So it really had no purpose at all. But there were vocabulary words and kind of pictures, and you wanted the child to tell you what it was. And I remember one of the pictures was a swamp. And I'm thinking, if ever there's like some kind of picture that like rural kids might naturally know, but city kids would not know.
Don't have the context.
Yeah, I heard that in college boards years ago, if there was a word like yacht, a really stupid rich person would know what a yacht is, but someone who grew up in a poor, landlocked environment would have to read a lot or really have a lot of different life experiences to know what it is. So it isn't that hard to slant those tests intentionally or not to make some people, allow some people to do better than others.
I don't remember the details, but there was an intelligence test, and I think this example is out of Chicago. And one of the questions was like comparison, and you're comparing, a toothbrush to bathroom refrigerator and a couple of other things. And the black and impoverished people were associating the toothbrush with a refrigerator. Well, obviously, the nice white suburban people, and were always putting their toothbrush in the bathroom. And that was the correct answer, the only correct answer. People who live in poverty with roaches tend to put their toothbrushes in the refrigerator to keep them clean. So just that kind of, whether it's intentional or just blinders that we don't even see we have, it's a setup for failure. And, what I saw with No Child Left Behind and so much of that was just reallocating more resources to the schools that, the successful schools, the ones who didn't need it, and away from, and more rigid authoritarian control, special masters, in the poorer communities. And that just struck me as an atrocious way to deal with it. Back in the 70s and 80s, we proved link between poverty and this. This is not questionable. This is settled science. Anybody who doesn't understand that a child coming to school hungry is not going to be in that same capacity to learn as somebody who doesn't. As well as just having those resources as far as rich experiences that you were talking about.
Or knowing where you're going to sleep that night or anything like that is going to really impact your ability to concentrate on the studies. I once heard a generalization that in a capitalist society, when government or whatever wants to incentivize rich people, they give rewards, and when they want to incentivize poor people, they dole out punishments, punitive measures. And it's like people really aren't that different in a way that this really works, that these diametrically different approaches based on your income are going to really work the way, in theory, they will.
Capitalism, the entire purpose of it is to trickle money up to the very richest. It will always have, and it needs to have, losers, people it decides, because we've got a bunch of very low-income, horrible jobs that nobody wants to do with no benefits, and they're really under oppressive situations. Nobody can, I don't even think state of Connecticut is up to $15 minimum yet, although it's on the thing. Yeah. $15 is not enough to live by.
It's not a living wage at all.
And we make excuses like, well, they made their choices, or, if only you'd be more fiscally conservative, or, and it's just absurd. If you look at the costs of housing, the way, and especially with the way right now food and gas are going up, these equities are there on purpose.
Well,
and there can never be capitalism without that. It's been less so at some times. during the 50s and 60s, especially for white people,
Yeah.
a lot more entered the middle class. It was, again,
Right.
as so many things in this country, racially unequal, as far as, World War II, GI Bills, and,
Right.
all the other economic benefits.
Yeah.
And I think, it's gonna really require people coming together in a big way. But capitalism has a lot of stopgaps against that, promotes racism, because then black and white people are going to be fighting among themselves instead of fighting the oppressive powers. And, many other examples right along the line.
Yeah.
Right now women are forced to fight for their body autonomy,
This last year, it seems as though we got all the wrong lessons from COVID. I mean, there were some things that we could have really learned from this whole COVID disaster, like, universal health care. When people actually have had the opportunity in a very limited way over the last 2 years. If you felt sick and you wanted a COVID test, you could get it without worrying whether you'd have to give up lunch that day to get it or dinner that day, because guess what? It was paid for. You didn't have to weigh, am I going to buy my prescriptions or am I going to eat? So we've actually...
My vaccinations and booster shots are free as well. So we can do free health care.
We can do it. And people kind of have had a chance to experience it. But unfortunately, it seems as though like the empire is striking back in a way. And in this past state session, things had the ability to get much, much worse in terms of more of the healthcare dollars being used to enrich big corporations and to potentially deny healthcare. So there should have been some lessons. Another lesson, and you mentioned the bad job situation, that people who are in low-wage jobs are told, well, go get a different job. But the problem is these are really essential services that the low-wage workers are engaged in. So during COVID, we did see many people leaving these jobs.
Low-wage people are considered essential, but not essential enough to give a living wage.
And there has been such shaming of people who didn't want to work in awful conditions because their services really are essential. If they're so essential, they should be supported, and you should be able to live on it.
There was an article on NPR I was listening the other day, and they hear the United States has more expensive healthcare than everywhere else in the world. Can AI help? And it's like, are you kidding me? Not one mention in this entire article about the fact that we're for profit and every other country in the world is not.
Right.
That couldn't possibly be responsible for the outrageous sums that we pay for healthcare. In my mind, it's if you're giving artificial intelligence to run medical things to for-profit things, they're just going to use it for things like, that 56-year-old diabetic has been in the hospital a lot. She's really raising up rates but not putting as much money in. What's the equation when we're talking profit-driven? Me, that 56 person is me.
Yeah.
And the equation is just let her die. Because our only purpose under this capitalism is to make money for the wealthy. And in as much as that, we are valued. And so poor people in this country, in this state, are not valued. Governor Lamont just had a TV ad out. And he's like, thank you, Governor Lamont. You care about poor people by lowering property taxes. And it's like, so, property taxes is not really a boon for the wealthiest people. And it just seemed like such complete misinformation. And, we need structural changes. We need good, solid public transportation. We need good money much more equitably distributed throughout our education systems in town to town to town, so that we can balance that out. We need a higher minimum wage and higher than $15 so that people who are working can actually make enough to live on. And yes, I do believe we need universal health care. By every metric, it's shown to be more efficient for everyone except for the big insurance companies who rule Connecticut. And that's why you will not hear about it from anybody in the state, and why even our Democratic, Congress people will not touch it.
Most won't. And a lot of our state reps who are advocates for universal health care are just as frustrated with the mainstream Democratic, leadership. I mean, they stay in the party, and I kind of get it, but when people have asked me, well, what would it be like? How would a Green governor and lieutenant governor work with our legislators? My answer is a lot of the Democratic legislators I have worked with who have tried to bring this kind of legislation up, they're not having a good experience with the governor who is their own party. So one of the reasons that I am very excited that we are running a slate of Green Party candidates this year, and this is the first year since 2006 that we have petitioned to get pretty much a whole slate of statewide candidates, is you look at the two major party candidates for governor, it's two white men, neither of whom really has governmental experience. You have much more governmental experience than Ned Lamont did before he was elected.
Ned Lamont has experience as a CEO, and a CEO will always treat workers in one way and one way only. And we've seen Ned Lamont do this with our state workers. I have a friend who a couple of years ago retired from State DEEP, Department of Environmental Engineering, whatever it is. And one of the reasons they're having big retirements right now is because that if so many people, if you retire by a certain date, then you get much, much better benefits than if you retire after that date. Well, that's because the governor is cutting wages and benefits for our state workers. The problem with state budgets has nothing to do with state workers who are making livable wages with decent benefits. The problem is that we fail to tax the rich at rates that they should, that we fail to really address, issues of poverty and, inequalities in this state. I don't believe a CEO is even capable, they don't even have it in their worldview to look at it from that perspective. For a CEO, workers are the enemy.
I think even those who are well-meaning can't look at it from that perspective. I happened to work for Head Start in the mid-90s when Husky was expanded in Connecticut. And one thing they did, the first year, they brought in all the hospitals in Connecticut to take the Husky insurance. And it was good legislation. It made health insurance accessible to a lot of people. But the first year, one thing they didn't even consider was bringing in hospitals outside of Connecticut. So in my area, people who live in Pawcatuck, Connecticut, who live within walking distance to Westerly Hospital in Rhode Island, suddenly couldn't go to Westerly Hospital, and Lawrence Memorial in New London, which is 25 miles away, was their nearest hospital healthcare. So it was corrected, but I keep thinking about that even these people who were working on very well-meaning, helpful legislation, couldn't even consider what the ramifications of their actions was because it wasn't part of their life experience.
They don't even have it in their perspective.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily because they're bad people, but they're people, when we have a government that is so, and I'm not making it as an over blanket statement, but overwhelmingly our representatives tend to be people who are better off and in better off position. They have, the funds and the resources to be able to not work and campaign, and they've got the position and the connections to get the funding.
Our voters actually are also the same group, which is a challenge, I know, in both Willimantic and New London, that it is very hard to get people who feel so disenfranchised to feel as though voting will make any difference.
And it doesn't. They're right. I have to validate that entirely, because if you're stuck voting for Democrats or Republicans, you are voting for a corporate party. And, and that perspective is always going to be, the bottom line is going to be the bottom line. It's money, it's dollars and cents. What I've seen over the last 20 or so years, even more so, is, schools are being running like corporations, universities being run by corporations. Everybody, much more corporate model, quote unquote accountability, doesn't have anything to do with corruption like you think it might. It's the accountability that poor people have to be accountable to rich people and to systems that specifically marginalize them. And, it's just, when both parties are just as authoritarian as each other, there's not a whole lot of policies, on the national level, for example, that Biden has really changed from Trump. He's just as deporting as many people and,
and actually bombing more people. Not that I want to defend Trump, because I think he's an awful human being that brings out the awful in others. However, we are literally bombing more people now.
Kids are still in cages. Our funding, things like debt relief for colleges hasn't come through. There's this one example which is being touted as like, well, they're doing debt forgiveness. It's like, no, they found fraud in one company and they're holding the company accountable. It's not the same thing as debt forgiveness. And here in the state of Connecticut, I've seen my daughters went to UConn and the prices are just rising so steadily. This is supposed to be a state university. That's, back in the 60s, what the tuition was of it? Zero,
What?
Literally nothing. When I went there in the late 80s and 90s, I was able to work full time and pay my way through college. Now my daughter's going through, did not have that experience at all because it's so much more expensive even then.
Wow.
And then that goes into questions of accessibility. Well, there's community colleges, except that we're doing something to reduce the community college system as well. Make it more efficient, by cutting out a couple and combining other ones. And all this does is make things less accessible. That with the whole cultural, trend that you have to get the college degree and trade schools are just for, other worthless people, which is ridiculous in my mind. We should have multiple options for multiple people, right. And we should be focusing on those who've been marginalized and left out of the economy much more. And I don't believe either of the white male millionaires really just has that perspective. This is one of the reasons that Michelle Louise Bicking came up with the whole room at the table theory.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Because right now, there isn't room. There's not room for poor people. There isn't room for black people. There isn't room for queer people, and other people have been marginalized. Why are we so grouchy and angry all the time at all the things? Well, because we're being screwed by these systems.
And it's a rich state like Connecticut. It should be a big table.
And if we don't, it's just an oppressive system. It's the rich people who are making the rules that poor people have to follow. And nothing of that is going to change. It cannot change until we have a much broader representation of the citizenry. You asked before, a little bit about my history. I've been working in group homes and, paraprofessional jobs all my life. I've been working class my whole life. Despite getting that master's degree, it doesn't really help if you're a marginalized person quite so much.
And some jobs are just marginalizing. You know, my two siblings are college professors, and I was more a generalist and worked in early childhood education. And there were definitely class differences between me and my siblings because early education is not valued, even though we know that the most important brain growth happens from birth to 5.
Most people working, and I worked in this field as well, are working for minimum wage. I've often called it one of the most under-respected jobs because, yes, it is very, very important. And yet, you know, what happens when we're paying people minimum wage with little or poor benefits, you're going to get a rollover of people on the whole, which is not the best for the students. You know,
I could only stay in it really because it was the second income in the household, and most of the jobs did allow access to health insurance, which with a self-employed spouse was something. Mm-hmm. But I never earned more than $35,000 a year, just without. I could have made a jump to being an administrator, but I actually think working directly with the kids is more important and more rewarding. So and that $35,000 a year was a very long work week with very few vacation days. So you mentioned the room at the table, you know, inclusive of all people, but I think I really like that tagline got attached to this campaign because it also refers, in my mind, to allowing new ideas and perspectives to the table, not just like the individuals, but with the consolidation of media that we've seen over the past few decades, the end of the fairness doctrine, it really is harder and harder to get divergent viewpoints and serious conversation out there.
I mean, unfortunately, when we do get some of these progressive ideas, it's the Democrats who are leading the attack against it. They don't have room for non-corporate ideas. They're not making room at the table for the Democrats in their party who are pushing for universal health care. You know, they attack their own more than they do the Republicans.
They do.
And, you know, I think the Green Party and other third parties are essential just because we can give a voice to different ideas that are not being given play. Connecticut is, in fact, one of the better states as far as, you know, attacking climate change within the state. But there's just, you know, it's still so minimal. You know, as we say that, you know, the governor has pretty much ceded all control over, like, the Killing Leaf fracking thing to corporate America. Well, there's nothing I can do. Of course you can. You're just choosing not to. You won't do anything because you're beholden to corporations and you can't confront them. And that's a big issue. You know, we've got a great manufacturing base in the state. Why aren't we trying to move and convert some of that over to making solar panels and wind and different solutions?
I don't know what the answer is.
There's so much more we can be doing, and things that will both bolster the economy and serve to make, you know, better contributions to changing the environment or stopping the environment from being changed. For one example, you know, I see they passed the police reform and they're banning chokeholds or something, and that's nice, that's good as far as police, but police still have qualified immunity, which means they can kill anyone they want and just say, I was afraid for my life. And most of them get away with it. When both parties are so strictly authoritarian, then what kind of choices do we have? When both parties are just serving the corporate plan, then what choices do we really have?
Yeah, well, I think you living in Willimantic and me living in New London, we have similar perspectives on policing. I'm usually treated pretty well by the New London police, but one reality is that our town is very diverse, very black and brown, and our schools are majority black and brown students. I think when you factor in the older population, maybe it's 50-50. But the police force is very largely white and often don't live in New London, but live in East Lyme or Waterford or some of the Montville, some of the surrounding towns. And it almost feels like an occupying force. Even when they're acting benign, it feels like they're coming from the wealthy suburbs to keep order in the disorderly city or something.
Just that narrative in and of itself, I think, is very telling. Drugs happen in suburbs, violence happens in suburbs, but when it happens in an urban environment, then, it's a much worse issue. I've seen proliferation of police in schools. Well, not only is there no evidence that that does any good to protect the safety of our students, there's plenty of evidence showing that, and again, especially our black and brown children are being disproportionately, sent on that school to prison pipeline and harassed, and they're, much more likely to be considered unruly or, whatever excuse they use to use force. In my mind, if we've got the money to be able to station police officers in these schools, we've got the money to add like another full-time counselor who might be able to help these students in different ways. And, I don't know, personally, the knee-jerk reliance on brute authoritarianism strikes me as a very dangerous trend and a very dangerous attitude to approaching social issues. And I won't even call them social problems. Poverty is a social problem. Poor people are not problems. Racism within this country, within this state, and it is rampant within this state, I promise you, is a problem. People of color are not. We've got a lot of things that we need to work on. And we need solutions other than just brute force to beat them down and keep them obedient. We need to empower people more equally. I mean, this is shown again and again and again. If you increase incomes and standard of living for a community, not just for individuals, but for a community as a whole, use of drugs go down, crime goes down, violence goes down, weapon use goes down, high school graduation goes up. And when we've got both our parties steering us in the exact opposite direction, I view that as a problem. And that's one of the reasons I want to run, just to give voice to different solutions that are much more humane and, frankly, much more effective.
And at this point, I want to make a pitch to people who are watching also, but Connecticut Voices for Children, ctvoices.org, I think, they're a nonprofit, and they have been working on Connecticut budget issues in a very holistic way for a long time, at least 25 years. And they did put out a report a few years ago about how school resource officers have been shown not to reduce crime in schools, but have greatly increased arrests of children, especially black and brown and poor kids. But they have also done a lot of documentation on how Connecticut could create a progressive tax that holds the millionaires and billionaires accountable to paying their fair share, not just like opting out of public services and public support. And they've done good research that is ignored largely. And I feel as though they have so many materials on what fair budgeting would look like, how we could shift our Connecticut taxation system to promote more equality and not keep driving our inequality like wider and wider and wider. So the third part to room at the table, to me, when I think about it, it's bringing all people to the table, including especially those who are being marginalized now and disenfranchised now, bringing new ideas to the table, especially those that challenge the narrative we're being fed. But the third part of it is to bring all political parties to the table, because what I've seen in New London is as the Democratic Party has gained dominance, although the Democrats are fairly sincere in trying to reduce barriers to getting to the polls to Election Day, they haven't really done much to increase people's sense that voting makes a difference. So I was looking, 10 years ago, in 2011, there were about 4,600 people voted in New London municipal elections. And in 2021, 10 years later, it was like under 3,000. And there were some reasons. 2011 had a mayoral race with 6 candidates running. There was an important referendum on the ballot. So people did feel like there was more at stake. This time a year ago, the Democrats swept, and they rejoiced, but the turnout was one third down from what it had been a decade before. So I feel like you should stop, people should stop celebrating winning on the basis of not many people voting.
There's not much to really celebrate when most of the state is in fact gerrymandered. Most of your towns are solidly red or solidly blue, and ain't nobody budging any of it. And that's, it's too many people, in my opinion, are just locked into, well, this is my team and we're winning, woohoo! And, then on the other hand, this is my team and we're winning, woohoo! And, it's locked out a lot of the other ideas and a lot of the other, if we can't have genuine change and genuine options in our elections, then what are we voting for? And this is what Michelle, Louise Bicking, and myself are really fighting to do. We need to bring new voices, to that process. There are many, many issues in Connecticut, and, I love my state. I've lived here my entire life. I've got relatives that go back 400 years in this state.
Wow.
They're not alive.
Yeah.
But, I've got roots in this state, but I can still recognize when there's issues. And, you're considered like this, just angry outcast. And it's like, no, it's because I love my state and I love the people here. And yes, I do love and appreciate the values of equity and equality, that I want to give voice to all those issues. And I don't hear those things being talked about very much by either party. And that concerns me greatly, because these issues genuinely affect people's lives. And
so let's talk a little bit about the Green Party in Windham for just a couple minutes, because as of last year's elections, Windham, Connecticut is the town with most Green Party elected officials in the United States. So what have you all done in Windham that to have some success, and how has it changed your town or impacted your town? Again, because Democrats pretty much own Willimantic, we're not able to make all the changes that we would like to, certainly. Just getting things on an agenda is a challenge sometimes. But, we do offer up
genuine alternatives. There have been many people who've been working on creating a civilian review board within Willimantic, working very hard. Green Party are well represented in that group. We've had help from Working Family Party and some NAAC members who are choosing to work within the Democrats. But we've also done, we show up. We've shown up, and we have Jean Dismay, who's just always done so much to, really increase volunteerism in the town and bring attention to our local businesses and help them out. We've got Doug Larry, who's really been trying to inject sanity and accountability to our financial. We've got myself and a number of others who are active in the NAACP. I've been trying to be active with the queer community, like I've gotten our flag hoisted for Pride Month on different occasions, and just trying to show up, support. So, we're involved in the town, and we're active, and we do the work. And I think it's amazing, going back to Margaret Mead, that small group of people making a difference. It's my paraphrasing it is, everything in the world starts with 5 people in a living room. And when you come together and you stick with that for a long time, and you keep showing up and keep trying to make changes that other people are talking about and giving voices to these issues and listening to people, it kind of starts to prove your worth over time.
And I think for some of us who are active, not just locally, but at the state level, our hope is this year we are running a full slate. We're currently in the petitioning process, which we'll talk about before the end of the show, within the next 5 minutes or so, is to bring that kind of insertion of the Green Party values and also the connection between activism and electoral action, because you need an interaction of both of them to really create change to the state, and not, Willimantic, bring that success to, to the state level, just bring that other dimension. So I do want to talk a little about the reality of being a minor party. I think I mentioned briefly that the last time we petitioned a full slate of statewide offices was 2006. That was 15 years ago. Long time, 16 years ago. It was a long time ago. But what we are in the process of doing now, maybe we can zoom in on this. Some of you might have seen this. Minor parties, unlike the Republicans and Democrats, who get any candidate on any ballot line in the state automatically, whether they've run on those lines for the past 5 years or not, minor parties, and there are 4 recognized ones, Working Families, Green Party, Libertarians, and Independent Party, have to earn every single line either by running someone in the previous election or by petitioning on. So right now, between now and early August, Green Party people will be asking you often to sign a petition to get Green Party candidates' names on the ballot. We hope you also vote Green, but there's no obligation. This is simply a petition stating that the Green Party and other minor parties deserve to be listed on the ballot, to be included in forums, in conversations about issues, and we need 7,500 valid signatures, which it's less than 1% of the voting public in Connecticut. But 1% in a city like Wyndham or New London is very easy for a town-wide office. you might need 100 signatures. It's easy, but Connecticut, especially in the rural areas, is not so easy to catch up with people. So we are going to be doing petitioning for the next couple months quite intensively. And if anyone wants to help, you can get in touch with ctgreenparty@gmail.org, or if you know me on Facebook, message. If you're on Facebook with Cass, you can get in touch with her. There are a lot of different ways to get in touch with the Green Party of Connecticut, or with us local branches, to either you could sign, or you could help get your friends and family to sign as well.
And I believe we need 7,500 clear signatures, which means a considerable amount more than that, because because of legibility or whatever other issues, some of those will be rejected. It's just how the process goes. This is essential for Greens, especially in towns that do not have a town committee. To be part of that state organization, we need to be able to have at least one state or national. I think the congressional,
I agree.
thing is enough for anyone in the state to be able to register green and to be able to, maintain our status and help to bring some of these ideas to the table.
Yeah, that is a good point about the reality of minor parties, that any of the minor parties can lose their status. In theory, I guess the Republicans and Democrats could, but honestly, they kind of changed the rules a little. The Republican Party in Connecticut was kind of at risk of dropping off the bottom of major parties, and I believe the rule was changed that to be a major party, you have to have 20% of the electorate registered with your party. And I think they changed it to 20% of those registered with the party, because 50% of the people in Connecticut or nearly are not registered with a party. They're unaffiliated. And of the Republicans are actually less than 20% of the total as a result.
It's the major parties making the rules for the elections. And coincidentally, they always make the rules to favor themselves. This is one place where Democrats and Republicans come together beautifully, almost magically, is to squash more independent votes and smaller parties, and make the loopholes constantly harder for us to be able to, maintain and set bars for themselves for us that aren't necessarily there for the other parties. And help each other out when they need to.
And I think we probably have maybe 3 to 5 minutes left. And I think the last thing I want to kind of bring up is how the Green Party is different from other parties, including most other minor parties.
Well, one of our things that appeals to me about the Green Party is that we do not and will not accept corporate money or donors, and I think that distinguishes us in a great way. You'll hear again how money doesn't influence politics, while both parties take the money and then create policy that benefits their donors. Of course, money influences politics. It's basically legalized corruption, and we can't have. All the money and the corporate money in even the both major parties, does a lot to really squash independent voices within those parties. So we believe that in order to really make effective systemic change, we cannot be influenced by monetary and the wealthy people. We do. We're living in a system that requires us to fundraise and have some money, but we get all small donations. We are very much grassroots democracy oriented, bottom up all the way. And, as state leaders and local leaders within our parties, you and I both well know the challenges that are involved in that. But, it's we don't avoid things like this because they are more challenging. You know, it's a worthwhile goal in and of itself to give as much voice to as many people as possible.
You know, one of our city council candidates last fall, Eddie Long, what he would say whenever he was speaking was, you know, the easy path is the wrong path. And I think that is quite true. But, you know, I think the problem of money in politics, of course, with Citizens United, it became worse over the last decade and a half. But it seems also that everything is getting commodified. And, you know, once education and housing and healthcare are all profit points for people rather than seen as human needs, it is a problem.
It just strikes me as so abominable that things people need for life are so commodified and so profit driven. Nothing good has ever come of this, doing things this way, and nothing ever will. Yeah, housing for people because people need a place to live.
Right.
Healthcare for everybody because that's essential to living.
Right.
We've got the resources. It's a matter of where are we putting those resources in. I mean, you know, how many more attack helicopters or, you know, nuclear submarines do we need when we have people starving on the streets and people who cannot get a good education and don't know where all their meals are coming from, and choosing between medicine and meals? And, you know, there should be no choice. We have the resources to be able to take care of everybody. And we choose things like military, things like, you know, corporate profit, things that benefit those who already have more than enough. Michelle Louise Bicking and I believe there's room at that table for a lot more than just those people.
So, yeah, if anyone wants to get more information, get involved, help with the petitioning effort, you can contact ctgreenparty@gmail.com, and we'll get the information to everyone. Next week, I am going to try to get an interview with Michelle Louise Bicking. That one might be remote, but what can we say? So, but anyway,
any listeners or watchers out there, stay tuned for that. She is a very powerful and intelligent speaker. You're going to want to hear what she has to say.
Yeah, and thank you, Cass, for coming down to New London and, you know, sharing some views and putting another face to the Green Party in this area. And to all of you listening, we'll, you know, be back next week, hopefully with Michelle.
Pleasure and an honor as always. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll be in touch. And happy petitioning.
Coming to a farmer's market.
When the rain don't